January 1953. The crisp, green expanse of Vancouver's Stanley Park, cloaked in winter's chill, was a place of serene beauty. But that tranquility was shattered one cold morning when a park groundskeeper stumbled upon something chillingly out of place. Beneath a dense thicket of trees, hidden under a layer of leaves and moss, lay the skeletal remains of two small children. The scene was haunting. Tiny bones, weathered by time, were partially buried in the soil. A rusty tin lunchbox lay nearby, along with tattered pieces of cloth, remnants of a bygone time. The once idyllic park now bore the weight of a dark secret. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the community. Who were these children? How did they end up here? And most importantly, who was responsible? The police were called in immediately, and an investigation was launched. The media dubbed it the Stanley Park mystery, but answers would not come easily. Discovery of the incident. Date: January 14th, 1953. Location: Stanley Park, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. The remains of the two children were found in a remote, rarely visited section of Stanley Park. Dense bushes concealed the area, creating an eerie isolation that seemed almost intentional. The scene was one of devastation, telling a silent but brutal story of what had transpired. The skeletal remains of the children were laid side by side, a grim testament to their tragic fate. Nearby, a hammer, or perhaps a hatchet, lay rusted but unmistakably sinister, later identified as the likely murder weapon. A woman's woolen coat, worn and tattered, had been used to cover the children's small bodies, as if in a twisted gesture of care. Scattered among the remains were children's clothes, faded and dusty from years of exposure to the elements. The fabric was fragile, disintegrating at the slightest touch, and offered little clue about the identities of the victims. Investigators quickly determined that the murders had not been recent. Based on the state of decomposition and the artifacts found, they estimated the crime had occurred around 1947, 6 long years before the grim discovery. Stanley Park, once a haven of peace, now held a terrible secret buried within its depths. Who were these children? What led to their untimely deaths? And who would commit such a crime, leaving their bodies hidden for years? Who were the children? Initially, the investigators were at a loss. The identities of the children remained a mystery, with no missing persons reports matching their descriptions. Forensic experts estimated the children to be between 6 and 10 years old. Until they could be identified, both the media and law enforcement referred to the victims as the babes in the wood, a haunting name that would forever tie their fate to the tragedy. Forensic findings. One child's cause of death was clear: a devastating blow to the head, likely inflicted by the hammer or hatchet found at the scene. The second child's cause of death was less definitive. No direct injuries were found on the bones, but investigators concluded that they, too, had been murdered. The first stage of the investigation. Interrogation of locals. The police canvassed the area, speaking with local residents, shopkeepers, and anyone who might recall 2 children disappearing years earlier. Yet, no one had any information. No neighbors reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious, and no one could identify the children. Evidence collection. Investigators turned their attention to the items recovered at the scene. The woolen coat was traced back to a Vancouver store, but records were incomplete, and the buyer could not be identified. The hammer or hatchet appeared to be a common tool, giving investigators little to work with. The lack of solid leads frustrated the investigators. The passage of 6 years had erased memories, decayed evidence, and, perhaps, buried the truth along with the children. Media coverage. The discovery of the babes in the woods quickly became a sensational story in the media. Newspapers, radio stations, and news outlets across Canada covered every detail of the mysterious case, hoping for a break that might lead to answers. However, despite the intense public attention, the media coverage did little to move the investigation forward. The case remained unsolved, and the public fascination grew, as did the speculation. Theories and suspects. Family involvement. One of the earliest theories proposed by investigators was that the children's deaths were connected to someone within their family or household. The murder had been carried out with a level of intimacy and planning that suggested the killer knew the children well. There was a chilling possibility that a relative, perhaps a parent or guardian, had decided to end their lives. Authorities began looking for families who had children that matched the victims' descriptions, but the investigation turned up no solid connections. Despite this, the theory persisted, haunting the case as a potential explanation for such a personal, brutal act. Shadow of poverty. Another prevailing theory was that the children had come from a poor or marginalized family. The grim economic conditions of the time, combined with the trauma and struggles of poverty, could have led someone to make a drastic, tragic decision. Some suggested that the children might have been victims of extreme poverty, perhaps even abandoned in the park in a desperate act of neglect. Hunger, mental instability, and depression may have driven someone to commit such an unspeakable act. While the theory seemed plausible to some, investigators could not find any concrete evidence to tie the children to such a background. Further inquiries into the area's social conditions also turned up no direct connections to known families facing severe hardship. Finally, the mystery revealed. 2021. After decades of silence, the case took a shocking turn in 2021. Modern forensic science, specifically DNA analysis, breathed new life into the investigation. With the advancement of DNA technology, investigators were able to finally extract usable genetic material from the children's remains. The analysis confirmed that both children were related, likely siblings, and they were not from Vancouver as initially suspected, but had connections to another part of Canada. The breakthrough came when the DNA matched that of distant relatives who had been unaware of the children's tragic end. In a series of emotional interviews, surviving family members revealed a complex history of the children's lives, including their disappearance in 1947. It was a family rift, a history of mental health issues, and a string of unresolved tensions that led to the fateful night in Stanley Park. While the full truth about the children's killer is still not entirely clear, the breakthrough in 2021 finally gave some closure to the case that had remained a dark mystery for almost 70 years. Children's identity revealed. After nearly 70 years of unanswered questions, the identities of the babes in the wood were finally revealed. The two children were named David Dalton and Derek Dalton. They were half-brothers, both born to a woman struggling with severe emotional and financial hardships in Vancouver. David, the older of the two, was 10 years old at the time of their death, while Derek was only 6. The revelation of their names brought an unexpected wave of grief and relief, as their surviving relatives now had a chance to remember them properly. However, the identity of the murderer still loomed over the family's history, casting a long shadow over their memories. Family history. The Dalton family's background was marked by poverty, instability, and emotional turmoil. David and Derek's mother, Margaret Dalton, was a woman who had endured significant hardship throughout her life. Struggling with mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, Margaret's emotional state had worsened as financial stress piled on. The weight of her struggles, combined with the isolation of being in a low-income community, created a volatile environment for her children. Family sources revealed that Margaret had been unable to provide a stable home for her sons, and at times, she seemed overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood. There were whispers among neighbors and relatives that Margaret had been unwell mentally and emotionally for much of her life, but nobody could have foreseen the horrifying outcome. Prime suspect, Margaret Dalton. With the new DNA evidence revealing the children's identities, the focus of the investigation shifted toward their mother. While Margaret Dalton had long been suspected of involvement, it was now clear that she was the prime suspect in the deaths of David and Derek. However, there was no conclusive proof that Margaret had physically committed the crime. She passed away many years ago, leaving behind a complicated legacy. Those who had known her described a woman who had been deeply troubled, often withdrawn, increasingly distant, and at times, even paranoid. But could these mental health issues have led her to commit such an extreme act? Investigators and psychologists who examined the case pointed out that her psychological state likely played a pivotal role in the murders. At the time of David and Derek's deaths, Margaret was suffering from severe emotional strain, and it was believed that a moment of mental collapse might have triggered the tragedy. But the precise reasons behind her actions may never be fully understood. Legacy. The story of David and Derek Dalton, once lost to history, left behind a legacy that would continue to haunt the city of Vancouver. Their deaths symbolized the dark consequences of neglect, mental illness, and poverty. While the mystery of their deaths had been solved, the emotional scars remained within the family and the community. The investigation's conclusion brought a sense of closure, but the pain of what had happened remained. The Dalton family's name became forever tied to one of Vancouver's most tragic, unsolved mysteries. For many, David and Derek's story was a reminder of the fragile line between love and violence, and how easily one's mental state could push a person toward unimaginable choices.